This is the Bishop's Palace in Kirkwall, built in the 1100s, the same time as the cathedral opposite, of red and yellow sandstone. From the 10th century until 1231, Orkney was ruled by Norse earls, Vikings, who included Haakon and Magnus until his martyrdom. The Norse earls were replaced by Scottish earls, as Norwegian influence declined. 2 later Earls Palaces remain in Orkney, although they are now in ruins. The Earls Palace in Kirkwall was begun in the early 17th century for Earl Patrick Stewart. He was one of Orkney's most hated landowners, and the palace was built with forced labour. The Earl's Palace at Bursay was built about 1574 by Earl Robert Stewart, father of Earl Patrick, who built the palace at Kirkwall. Today it is very ruinous, and it can be hard to imagine its former glory, but this was a fine Renaissance building around a central courtyard, surrounded by gardens as well as greens for bowling and for archery. We're now in Scale House, which was built in 1620, and scale is the Old Norse word for hall. And here we are in the dining room, and the table is laid as it was when the Queen Mother came for a meal for lunch in 1983. And the china in the cupboard is Captain Cook's dinner service, because this is where his ship docked in Stromness when they came back from Hawaii after he'd been killed. Scale House is unusual in that it has been owned and occupied by the same family since it was first built in the 1620s. The first occupant was Bishop George Graham, who moved to Orkney from Dunblane in 1615. In 1850, his descendant, William Graham Watt, became the man credited with discovering Skara Brae. This is the library. It used to be 2 small bedrooms, the door to one of which remains in the passageway, and Colonel Scarth, the 11th Laird, created this library and at the same time built the curious round window by the portrait. The portrait is the Colonel's only son, Walter Scarth, who was tragically killed at the age of 14 in an accident with a horse. It's certainly tragic. He looks a lovely boy. This is the drawing room, a wonderfully bright room with beautiful views of both the bay and the loch. It was created by the 11th Laird by removing a central bathroom between 2 smaller bedrooms. This is Mrs. Kathleen Scarth's bedroom. She was the wife and then the widow of Colonel Scarth, the 11th Laird. So she was widowed in 1972, and she lived alone here for the next 19 years, during the end rarely leaving her bedroom. This is one of the original parts of the house, the Bishop's bedroom, dating back to 1620 when Bishop George Graham lived here. The 4-poster bed belonged to him. He was Bishop of St. Magnus's Cathedral from 1615 to 1638. And the wood panel comes from his loft or his pew in St. Magnus's Cathedral. This little church on Lambholm, Orkney, which has come to be known as the Italian Chapel, is, apart from the statue of St. George in its vicinity, the only relic of Camp 60, which housed in the later years of the Second World War several hundred Italian prisoners. These men, captured during the North African campaign, were sent to Orkney to work on the Churchill barriers a massive series of concrete causeways that seal the eastern approaches to Scarpa Flow. The camp consisted at first of 13 or more cheerless huts, but the active Italians made concrete paths and planted flowers until the whole area was transformed. To preside over the camp square, an artistic prisoner, Domenico Chiocchetti, made the figure of St. George, built up from a framework of barbed wire covered with cement. New amenities were created, a theatre and a recreation hut, but one thing the camp still lacked, a chapel, and this lack had been deeply felt by the prisoners. Sometime late in 1943, 2 Nissen huts were made available to the prisoners. These were placed end to end and joined together, and Chiocchetti set to work to build a sanctuary in the end of the hut furthest from the camp. As he worked, his imagination caught fires. Ideas flooded his mind, but each one of them had to be expressed in terms of the simplest material, most of it second-hand and a proportion of it apparently worthless scrap. The unsightly corrugated iron of the hut was hidden by plasterboard, smooth above, panelled below. The altar, altar rail and holy water stoop, all beautifully designed, were moulded in concrete. Behind the altar were 2 windows of painted glass representing St. Francis of Assisi and St. Catherine of Siena. And Chiochetti's masterpiece, Madonna and Child, was lovingly painted based on a holy picture he had carried with him all through the war. To the east of Scarpa Flow there were, until the Second World War, 4 channels leading into the naval anchorage. These were blocked with sunken ships, and it was considered that attack from that direction by sea was impossible. Early in the war, however, in October 1939, a brilliant German U-boat commander, Lieutenant Commander Prien, took advantage of a gap in the defences of Holmes Sound and of an exceptionally high tide. He penetrated the flow and sank the battleship Royal Oak, which was anchored off Scarpa, managing to get out again safely. In the Royal Oak, over 800 men perished, and the Navy, having learned a hard lesson, left its Orkney anchorage until the entrances could be securely sealed. The method chosen was to lay massive barriers of stone and concrete on the seabed from island to island. The contractors were Balfour Beatty. This enormous task occupied several years. The total length of the 4 sections of the barrier is about 1.5 miles. In some places, the depth of the water was as much as 59 feet. As a foundation, more than 250,000 tons of stone and rock were laid on the seabed, and on top of this were built the causeways. They were constructed from 66,000 huge blocks of concrete, some weighing 5 tons and some 10 tons. These blocks are placed in varying positions all along either side of the barriers, their angles and crevices preventing the tide from sweeping over the carriageway that runs along the top. There was a labour shortage for people to work on the barriers, so in 1942 several hundred Italian prisoners of war were drafted in from Libya to assist in the work.